Hello, welcome to the Self-Learning Podcast by Dr. Sushma Singh. Let us start discussion on Unit 19, Formal Sector. And our topic is Employment Growth in Formal Organized Manufacturing. During the 1980s, employment in the organized sector was virtually stagnant, which had substantially increased in the 1990s. Between 1980 to 81 and 1990 to 91, employment in organized manufacturing grew at the rate of 0.53% per annum. In the next 5 years, 1990 to 1995, the growth rate was much higher, 4.03% per annum. Comparing favorably with the growth rate achieved in the 1970s. In the period 1990-91 to 1997-98, the growth rate of employment was 2.69%, well above the growth rate achieved in the 1980s and higher than the growth rate of the labor force. Effect of the economic reforms on the formal sector. The marked acceleration of employment growth, according to some scholars, in the formal sector in organized activities can be attributed to the process of major economic reforms that was initiated in India in 1991. It has been pointed out that the favorable effects in the employment was due to greater labor flexibility and increased trade orientation, to changes in the structure of industries in favor of labor intensive industries and techniques of production. On the other hand, it has also been pointed out by scholars that in some other ways the new economic policy is expected to have adverse effect on industrial employment. For instance, the economic reforms have resulted in increased competition, improved access to foreign technology and imported capital goods. This has resulted in a drive by industrial firms towards the adoption of advanced technology, which is likely to lead to increasing capital intensity of production. Also, as competition intensifies, industrial firms may try to save cost and become more competitive by cutting down on employment, particularly those firms that are characterized by overstaffing. Many scholars, therefore, are advocates of this pessimistic viewpoint of the economic reforms on the formal sector, and point out to the fact that the adverse effects may be so strong that they may outweigh the favorable effects of the economic reforms in the long run. Now, let us move to the next point, characteristics of formal sector employment in the post-reform period. The first one is public sector, private sector and joint sector growth in employment. This presents a comparison of employment growth rate between public sector and private sector, including joint sector factories. It can be discerned from this that in 1970s employment grew rapidly in both the public and private sector factories. There was a sharp deceleration in employment growth in 1980s in both the public and private sector factories. In the 1990s, growth rate of employment in the public sector factories has come down further. It was only 0.4% per annum between 1990s and 1997. By contrast, the growth rate of employment in private sector factories has recovered and surpassed the growth rate prevailing in the 1970s, with the consequence of that almost entire increase in employment in organized manufacturing that has taken place in 1990s can be accounted for by public sector factories. The second one is distribution of employment by size class of factories. The distribution of employment by size class of factories shows that there was a marked change in the size structure in 1980s and more so in the 1990s. The size class 50 to 500 employment gained, while the size class 2000 to 4999 and 5000 plus lost heavily. Since the factories in the lower employment size classes are more labor intensive, these change in size structure had a favorable effect on employment growth. The size class 5000 plus is most capital intensive and least labor intensive, and the sharp decline in the relative share of this size class in 1990s and the increase in the relative share of the size class 50 to 99, 100 to 199 and 200 to 499 must have made a significant contribution to employment growth in this period. In this context, it is said that the economic policy regime has a major influence on the size structure of industries in the formal sector. In the early 1960s, factory employment was heavily concentrated in very large establishments. The share of small and medium sized factories was relatively small. This imbalance in the structure of the manufacturing sector was largely a consequence of the economic policies of the government. Protection in investment incentives, credit control and promotion of industry in the public sector discriminated against the small and favored capital intensive, large scale establishments. The change in the size structure that has taken place in 1980s and 1990s, a decline in the relative share of big units and a rise in the share of small and medium sized factories, is arguably a correction of the structural imbalance prevailing earlier. Since the imbalance in the size structure was largely a consequence of the economic policies, the correction that has taken place in the last 2 decades may be attributed, at least in part, to changes in economic policy, specifically in liberalization of industrial and trade policies. It is seen that the growth rate of employment increased in 1990s in most industries. There was almost across the board acceleration in employment growth. As against that, the growth rate of value added declined after 1990s in the majority of industries, even at the aggregate level. Therefore, it appears that some common factors have favored employment growth in a large number of industries in the post-reform period, even though output growth has not accelerated. The fourth one is growth rate in real wages, product wages and man days per employee. It is also seen that in 1980s employment declined in 4 two-digit industries: food products, cotton textile, jute textile, wood products. These industries are labor intensive and accounted for 41% of the total manufacturing employment in 1980s. In all these cases, the downward trend in employment was arrested in the 1990s and reversed. This reveals that the growth rate of real wages in agriculture, manufacturing declined significantly in the 1990s, and this occurred also in a majority of the industries. Furthermore, the inter-industry pattern of changes in rates of growth in employment and real wages, an inverse relationship can be seen between the two. The extent of acceleration in employment growth is generally higher in those industries in which there has been a greater decline in the growth rate of real wages. Nagaraja and Bhatrota have laid considerable stress on increase in man days per employee as a cause of sluggish employment growth in 1980s. This shows, however, that the increase in man days per employee was rapid only in the case of food product industry. For the rest, the rate of increase was not high. At the aggregate level, the rate of increase in man days per employee was 1.11% per annum, which to a large extent was due to the increase that took place in product food industry. That it seems Nagaraj and Bhalhotra have given undue emphasis on this factor as a cause of jobless industrial growth in 1980s. Also, the change in the growth rate of man days per employee between the two periods is small for most industries, and this cannot be a major cause of the acceleration in employment growth in 1990s. Now let us wind up the session and take rest. Thank you very much for engaging yourself with the Self Learning Podcast.